The night was silent in Big Timber County, an isolated region of Montana in the United States, surrounded by dense forests and mountains as imposing as scary. It was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, where the neighbors knew each other by the name. The streets were poorly lit, and the forests, though magnificent, carried an air of mystery. There, local legends were passed from generation to generation, feeding stories that ranged from ghosts of miners and wild predators that no one could identify. That night, a dense mist covered the forest like a blanket, drowning up any sound. Charlie Bennett, a local farmer, was locking the shed after feeding her sheep. He was a robust man, in 60, 1 year old, with grey hair and calloused hands. Something bothered him. He felt a strange cold, as if something observed him. Trying to ignore the sensation, he took the flashlight and walked toward the house, but stopped abruptly when he heard a sound that froze his spine. A long, low and guttural moan from the corral direction. "It can only be a coyote," he murmured to himself, trying to hide his discomfort. And before we continue with this intriguing story, be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This helps us bring more content like this to you. Now let's go back to the story. Holding the flashlight hard, he returned to the corral, but what he found made him lose his voice. 2 of his sheep were dead, ripped brutally. The blood dripped everywhere, forming puddles on the ground floor. The marks left in the body of the animals were deep, accurate, as if something had attacked with extreme strength and speed. But what really caught his attention was the smell. It was not the metallic odor of the blood, but something more, a nauseating smell, a mixture of sulfur and rotting meat. "My God, what was that?" he whispered, his breathing heavy. The noise of branches breaking in the distance made him rotate the flashlight for the forest. But all he could see were the shadows of the trees, real estate, and dark. Despite the deadly silence, Charlie knew she wasn't alone. He couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, the news spread quickly throughout the small town. In the local market, where people used to talk about the weather and the last hunt, the sheep massacre became the main subject. Among the most curious was Sam Daniels, a young reporter who worked in the local newspaper, Big Timber Gazette. Sam was 27 years old, ambitious, and dreamed of leaving that city to build a successful career in Chicago or New York. When he heard reports about mutilated animals, he felt a mixture of fascination and skepticism. "Probably a hungry bear or a lobekatea," he said as he scored something in his notebook. "It wasn't a bear or wolf, boy." The voice of Mary Hopkins, an elderly woman who lived there since she was born, sounded behind him. "I've seen wolves attacking cattle before. They don't leave the bodies like this. And that smell, oh, you wouldn't understand." Sam rolled his eyes discreetly, but decided to investigate. He went to Charlie's farm, who was still visibly shaken. Upon arriving there, he was received with suspicion. "You're a reporter, aren't you?" asked Charlie. "If you came here to invent one of these sensational stories, you can leave." "It's not that. I want to understand what is happening," Sam replied, trying to seem sincere. "The city people are scared, and I think someone needs to register what is happening." Reluctant, Charlie took him to the corral. Sam almost vomited when he saw the state of animals. He bent down to analyze the bodies more closely, but it was the smell that caught his attention. "What is that?" he asked, covering his nose with the sleeve of his shirt. "I have no idea, but I will tell you one thing. This was not the work of any animal I know," Charlie answered with a fixed look in the forest. Sam took some pictures and promised to return with more information, but what he didn't know was that this would be just the first in a series of deaths. 3 days later, the situation worsened. They were not just farm animals. Dogs began to disappear, and the few returning were dead, always with the same horrible marks on the body. Panic took over the city, and the residents began to arm. There were rumors that a creature had been spotted in the forest, but the reports were vague and inconsistent. "I saw something, yes," shouted a man at the local bar with a bottle of beer in his hand. "It was big, fast, It wasn't a bear, but there were eyes that shone in the dark. Most people laughed, attributing the story to too much alcohol, but Mary Hopkins seemed serious. "It's the same as my father said. He told stories about something like that when I was a child, something that lived in the mountains. It is not an ordinary animal." Sam, who was also at the bar, began to consider the possibility that there was something more. In the following days, he started studying old archives about the city and found mentions to a creature known as the Night Predator, a being that, according to legends, appeared every 20 years to hunt, killing anything alive in his way. Meanwhile, in the depths of the forest, something moved between the trees, fast, silent, and hungry. The following days brought a wave of panic to the city of Big Timber. There was no doubt that something was loose in the forest, and his presence was as evident as the oppressive silence that took over the woods at dusk. Local police, led by Sheriff Doug Thompson, began organizing night patrols. But for a department with only 4 officers, it was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. "This is going too far, Doug," said Hank Miller, one of the veteran police, while reviewing the growing list of residents who reported attacks. "First were the animals, now there are people disappearing." The sheriff ran a hand over his tired face. He was a pragmatic man, not believed in stories of monstrous creatures, but the evidence was accumulating. Last week, 2 people disappeared without traces: a teenager named Lucas Harper, who used to hunt near the northern stream, and Betty Langford, a widow who lived isolated in a cabin near the forest. "Let's organize a search tomorrow morning," Doug said, while giving a worried look at the region's map. "But I want no one to venture into the forest at night. Whatever we are dealing with, it is not safe." Meanwhile, Sam Daniels continued his investigation. After spending hours scouring old files in the basement of the local library, he found something that made him shudder: detailed reports of deaths and disappearances in Big Timber, dated 19 and 20, 19 and 40, 2, 960, 319, 1019, 1000, 1960, 3. The descriptions of the bodies found were identical to current mutilations. Even more frightening the standard, attacks always happened over a period of 3 weeks, followed by a complete silence that lasted decades. "It's like," Sam murmured, trying to organize his thoughts, "as if this thing woke up from time to time." He photographed the documents and decided to visit Mary Hopkins, believing she could have more information. When he arrived at the elderly house, he was greeted by a frightening view. Mary had all the windows closed, and barricades and crucifixes hung from every corner of the room. "You're dealing with something you shouldn't move, boy," she said, as she lit another candle. "This is not just an animal, it is an ancient curse. My father said that this creature is a vengeful spirit, something that has been expelled from his territory and now returns to punish the living." "Mary, I don't know if I believe in these things," Sam said, trying to hide the discomfort. "But whatever it may be, it can't be something supernatural. There must be a logical explanation." "And that's exactly what it's going to kill you, boy," Mary answered with a severe look. The same night, the forest became the scene of another massacre. Sheriff's Doug organized patrol found traces that led them to a place where the death smell was almost unbearable. In the center of a clearing, Lucas Harper's mutilated remains were scattered. It was impossible to ignore the fact that the body seemed to have been hunted, as if it were a prey. "My God," Hank said, turning his face not to vomit. Doug looked around, feeling the tension in the air. He knew something was watching them, but couldn't see anything but the shadows. "Let's get out of here now," he ordered. "Form a circle and keep the weapons pointed to the forest." But before they could move, a low and guttural sound echoed through the trees. It was a sound that seemed to come from all sides at the same time. Something moved between the shadows, too fast to see. The patrol retreated hurriedly, but not without consequences. One of the officers, Jim Carter, was dragged into the darkness in the blink of an eye. His screams were interrupted as quickly as they started, and all that was left was silence. When Doug and the others finally arrived back in town, they were slaughtered, dirty, and terrified. "This is not something we can face alone," Doug said to the mayor at an emergency meeting the next day. "We need the help of the National Guard or experts." "Experts," reported the mayor, a skeptical man named Arthur Davis. "Do you want to bring a bunch of scientists to investigate a local legend? This will end the reputation of the city." "Mayor, this is not a legend. People are dying," Doug shouted, hitting the table. But the mayor insisted on minimizing the severity of the situation, fearing that media attention would harm local tourism. Meanwhile, Sam decided to take a bolder attitude. He convinced two friends, Jake and Tommy, to accompany him to the forest to install movement cameras and record evidence of what was happening. "It's risky, but we need proof," he said, as he carried a backpack full of equipment. Jake, an experienced hunter, brought a rifle, while Tommy, an IT technician, carried the cameras and a high-power flashlight. The three entered the forest at dusk, with their nerves at the flower of the skin. As they advanced, the silence of the forest seemed increasingly oppressive. Daylight began to disappear, and the group set up the cameras at strategic points. "Let's just be a little longer," Sam said as he adjusted the last camera. "I want to see if we can capture any sound." But before they could end, they heard the same guttural sound that terrorized the police. The three were paralyzed, exchanging nervous looks. Suddenly, Jake pointed the rifle to the trees. "There! I saw something!" "Are you sure?" asked Tommy, trembling with fear. Before Jake could answer, something came out of the shadows. Fast as lightning, the creature hit the hunter, knocking him to the ground with brutal force. Sam and Tommy barely had time to react before it disappeared again. Tommy started running, but Sam hesitated for a moment, watching Jake's silhouette being dragged into the darkness. "Jake!" he shouted, but it was too late. The sound of bones departing and distant screams echoed through the forest, and Sam knew that if he stayed there, he would have the same fate. He ran without looking back and managed to reach the city, panting and in shock. "This is not an animal," he murmured while trying to explain what had happened. "It's much worse." The clock scored 2 in the morning, and Sam Daniels couldn't sleep yet. He was in the small room of his house, turning the images from the cameras that had been recovered from the forest. Each passing frame showed immovable trees, shadows, and nothing more. It seemed that the creature was smart enough to avoid any kind of capture, but Sam was sure there was something there. Then, in the last recording, he saw. For a short moment, as the camera shivered on the floor, probably during the Jake attack, a blurred figure crossed the painting. It was high, with disproportionate limbs and 2 agile movements for a human or any known animal. Scarier, however, were the bright eyes, 2 silver points that seemed to stare directly to the lens before the image cut to total darkness. Sam paused the video and widened the image. Despite the poor quality, it was possible to realize that this had a humanoid but distorted, with very long arms and sharp claws. His heart shot. "I knew," he murmured, almost out of breath. "This is not a legend." Meanwhile, Sheriff Doug Thompson faced increasing pressure. The bodies of Betty Langford and Jake had been found, and their condition was worse than anything else they had ever seen. The autopsy had revealed that the injuries were not only deadly, but deliberate, as if the creature was playing with their victims before killing them. "That's what worries me," Doug told Hank as they examined the evidence. "This is not just hunger. This thing is killing for fun." Hank shook his head, visibly disturbed. "Doug, we need to take these people from here. We cannot keep the city like this longer." "And how do you think I'm going to convince the mayor?" reported Doug. "He still thinks this will be resolved alone. So we make a decision on our own. These people trust you, Doug. If we don't act, this thing will keep killing." Doug was silent, the weight of visible responsibility on his face. He knew Hank was right, but he didn't know where to start. That night, Sam decided to go to the sheriff with the images he had captured. He entered the small office of the police station, holding the notebook as if it were a trophy. "I need you to see that," he said bluntly. Doug and Hank looked at the images carefully, and the silence in the room was heavy. When the video ended, Doug got up and ran his hands through his hair. "My God," he said. "That explains a lot." "So you believe me now?" asked Sam, trying to control the tone of frustration. "We believe, but that doesn't change the fact that we have no idea how to deal with it," Doug replied. Hank, who looked even more tense, suggested something that surprised everyone. "What if we called someone out? An expert, someone who deals with these things?" Doug snorted, but before he could refuse, Sam intervened. "I know someone, a biologist, professor at the University of Montana. He studies predators and unknown species. If anyone can help us, it's him." Reluctant, Doug agreed, and the next morning Sam contacted Dr. Victor Harlan, a man known for his research on isolated ecosystems. When Harlan arrived in town, his presence immediately drew attention. He was tall, with well-hated gray hair and a serious expression. "So you believe you're dealing with an unusual predator," he said after hearing the reports. "I'm not here to judge, but I need to see the evidence for myself." Sam showed the video, and for the first time Harlan seemed to lose his composure. He paused the image and widened the creature's frame. "This is not possible," he murmured, adjusting his glasses. "What do you mean?" asked Doug. "For years, there have been reports of creatures like this in various parts of the world, always associated with remote and never confirmed forests. Some call them alpha predators. They are not just hunters. They are extremely intelligent, capable of adapting and avoiding any form of detection. If this is what we are facing, you have a much larger problem than you think." "And how can we stop it?" asked Hank, anxious. Harlan hesitated before answering. "To be honest, I've never heard of anyone who got it." Meanwhile, something sinister happened in the forest. In Bill and Susan Peterson, a couple who lived isolated, the sounds of the night were particularly agitated. Susan, who was already nervous about the creature's reports, begged them to temporarily move to the house of relatives in the city. "We can't simply abandon everything, Susan," Bill said as he locked the windows. "This is all exaggeration." But before he could finish the sentence, a sound of something heavy falling on the roof made them freeze. Both looked up. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Then came the noise of claws scratching the wood. "Bill?" Susan whispered, with his eyes wide. He took the shotgun and took a few steps toward the door, but before he could do anything, the ceiling collapsed, and a gigantic shadow fell on him. Susan shouted, but the sound was interrupted abruptly. The next morning, Doug and Harlan arrived at the scene and found the cabana destroyed. There were no bodies, only blood spread everywhere. "She's getting bolder," Harlan said as she examined the marks, "and that means it won't stop." Doug looked at the forest, feeling a mixture of anger and fear. "Then we have to end her before it is over." The mood in the city of Big Timber was darker than ever. The streets were deserted, the stores closed, and the few remaining residents were armed or avoided, leaving home completely. The news of the attack on the Peterson cabana spread fear like a virus, and everyone knew that time was running out. At the police station, Doug, Sam, Hank, and Dr. Harlan gathered to draw a plan. Despite the sheriff's initial skepticism to rely on someone outside, Harlan's experience in dealing with extreme predators has begun to prove indispensable. "We need to attract this thing out of the forest," Harlan said, while drawing a map on the table with quick and accurate lines. "Predators like this are often territorial, but also very intelligent. He will only attack if he feels that he has an advantage." "How exactly do you intend to attract it?" asked Doug, crossing his arms. "We will use baits. Fresh meat, strategically positioned around an area where we can arrest it. I brought heavy traps, but we will need to improvise with what we have here." Hank let out a heavy sigh. "That seems suicide. This thing has killed 6 people and changed half the cattle of the region. Who guarantees that they will fall into a trap?" "We can't guarantee anything, but it's our best chance," Harlan replied, without blinking. The longer we take, bolder it will become. Doug looked at the map and the men around him. He knew no one wanted to face that, but there was no other choice. Right, let's set up the traps tomorrow night. Harlan, you lead. Sam, Hank and I will take care of the coverage. And one more thing, no one acts alone. This monster is hunting us, and we just have a chance to turn the game. At nightfall, the group headed for the forest. Harlan carried a backpack full of equipment, including metal claws and a chemical compound that emitted a strong blood smell, designed to attract predators. Sam and Hank were armed with rifles, while Doug carried a shotgun and a machete attached to his waist. The tension in the air was palpable as they walked into the woods. Each sound, every movement of the trees, made the hearts shoot. The oppressive silence seemed to say that the creature was aware of his presence. "Let's set up the traps here," Harlan said, indicating a clearing surrounded by rocks. "We have enough visibility to monitor the area." They worked quickly, installing the traps and positioning the baits. When everything was ready, they hid at different points around the clearing, ready to act to the smallest sign of movement. The first hour was too quiet, but as time passed, silence began to be replaced by strange sounds, light steps, breaking branches, deep breaths. Sam, who was hidden behind a fallen trunk, felt a chill when he noticed two bright points in the middle of the darkness. "It's here," he whispered on the radio. Harlan replied immediately, "Stay quiet. Do not make sudden movements." The creature appeared in the clearing. It was even scarier than anything Sam had imagined. Tall, with black hair that seemed to merge with the shadows, and so long and thin limbs that almost looked like spiders. His claws gleamed in the moonlight, and the bright eyes swept the area like flashlights. She moved toward one of the baits, but stopped suddenly. As if he realized something was wrong, he began to sniff the air and growl, a guttural sound that reverberated at night. "She knows," Hank murmured on the radio. Before someone could react, the creature made an impressive leap, completely escaping the clearing and disappearing in the forest. "Damn!" exclaimed Doug, leaving his hiding place. She realized. Harlan lifted his hand. "Wait, this is not over yet." Suddenly, a scream echoed through the forest. "It's Tommy!" shouted Sam, recognizing his friend's voice. Without thinking, he ran toward the sound, ignoring Doug's screams to wait. The group went after him, but the forest looked like an endless maze. They found Tommy minutes later leaning against a tree with a pale face and a deep wound on the shoulder. "She took me," he murmured, panting, "but let me live." "Why?" Harlan examined the wound quickly. "She didn't let him live for mercy. It's warning us." Doug looked at the man, confused. "Warning? What?" Before Harlan could respond, a resounding sound echoed through the forest, as if something was coming straight toward him. "Run!" he shouted. The group fired through the woods, but the creature was quick, moving between the trees like a blur. One by one, they began to separate, each trying to find an escape route. Doug and Sam ran together, but suddenly Sam stumbled on a root and fell. "Go, Sheriff! I take care of it!" he shouted, raising the rifle. Doug hesitated but knew he couldn't stay. He kept running, listening to Sam's shots behind him and the growing sound of claws approaching. When Doug finally left the forest, he was alone. At the police station, hours later, he told what had happened. "She's playing with us," Harlan said as she looked out the window. "And if we don't make a final decision, we're all gonna die." Doug closed his eyes, knowing that what was coming would be the longest night of his life. The storm was approaching. Dark clouds accumulated over Big Timber, and a sharp wind swept the deserted streets. The police station was silent, except for the sound of Doug's heavy breath. Sam, Harlan, and Hank, who prepared for the final battle, they knew they could no longer wait. The creature was hunting more boldly, and the recent deaths had made it clear that no one was safe. Doug looked at the group, trying to hide fear in his voice. "It ends today. No matter what happens, we have to stop it." Harlan approached the table, where was a detailed map of the forest. "Based on her behavior, I believe the creature has a burrow, or a place where it hides during the day. I made some simulations based on the tracks we found, and I think the most likely point is here. He pointed to a deep valley, surrounded by cliffs and accessible only by a narrow trail. "Are you suggesting that we go straight to her lair?" asked Hank incredulously. "This is suicide." "We have no choice," said Harlan. "If we can face her there, we'll have an advantage. She will not be able to escape so easily." Doug nodded, although he knew that the plan was risky. "Right. We take everything we have. Rifles, traps, explosives, flashlights, and this time no one separates." A few hours later, the group was on the trail, advancing in silence through the dark forest. Each step was careful, and each sound made them freeze. Harlan led the way as Doug closed the rear. The valley was just over 2 kilometers from the entrance of the trail, but the terrain was steep and treacherous. "Stay tuned," Harlan whispered. "If she's around, let's know." The nauseating smell of rotting meat began to fill the air, getting stronger with each step. When they reached the valley, the scene they found was worthy of a nightmare. In the center of a clearing, there was a pile of bones mixed with remains of meat and pieces of clothing. "My God," Sam murmured, covering his mouth. Harlan knelt to examine the bones. "This is not just a burrow, it is a hunting field." The group began to assemble the traps around the clearing, working as soon as possible. They placed explosives at strategic points and created a perimeter with trigger wires connected to metal traps. When everything was ready, they positioned themselves in a circle around the clearing, with the weapons pointed to the darkness. The silence was deafening until it was broken by a distant sound. Light, fast steps, accompanied by a guttural breath. She was coming. "Stay firm," Doug said, squeezing the shotgun. The steps were closer, and then suddenly the creature came from the shadows. She was even more frightening in the light of the lanterns. Her tall, slender body seemed composed of tense muscles, and her claws reflected the brightness of the moon. Harlan was the first to shoot, hitting a direct shot on the creature's shoulder. She shouted, such a tall and agonizing sound that made everyone shudder. Doug and Hank shot in sequence, but the creature was too fast, diverting and moving almost supernaturally. She advanced toward Hank, who tried to back down but stumbled into a root and fell. Before he could react, the creature was upon him, his claws cutting the man's chest into a quick and brutal movement. "No!" Doug shouted, firing at the creature. The shot hit her scrape, and she backed up for a moment, giving the group a chance to react. "Now! Activate the explosives!" shouted Harlan. Sam ran toward the detonator, but the creature noticed the movement. She jumped toward her, knocking him to the floor. Sam tried to fight, but the claws of the creature hit him in the arm, pulling a scream of pain. Doug ran to help, firing more shots, while Harlan activated one of the trigger wires. A deafening explosion shook the valley, and the creature's body was thrown against the rocks. For a moment, everything was silent. The creature was lying on the floor, immovable, and the group began to approach with caution. "Did we get it?" asked Sam, holding his wounded arm. But before someone could answer, the creature got up with a deafening roar. His body was covered in blood, but his eyes shone with almost human anger. "It can't be," Harlan murmured. She advanced again, this time with a devastating fury. Doug managed to hit 2 more shots, but it was not enough to stop her. The creature hit Harlan, throwing him against a tree hard enough to break bones. He fell to the floor, lifeless. Doug knew they had no more chances. "Sam, run!" he shouted as he held the shotgun and reloaded. Sam hesitated, but obeyed, running as fast as he could toward the trail. Doug stayed behind, facing the creature alone. He fired the last cartridge and then held the machete, waiting for the final attack. The creature advanced, and the fight was brutal. Claws and blades met in a fierce confrontation, but in the end Doug had no chance. He was knocked down, and the sound of his screams echoed through the forest. Sam managed to reach town at dawn, exhausted and bloody. He knew there was no one else. Doug, Hank, and Harlan were dead, and the creature was still alive. He entered the newspaper office and wrote the last headline of his career. "Big Timber's Beast. No one survived to tell." As he typed the last words, he felt a chill. The smell of rotting meat filled the air again. He didn't have to look at, he was no longer alone. The sun was born in Big Timber, but different from what the morning promised, the city seemed to plunge into a relentless darkness. The silence that took over the streets was not the same as previous days. It was a deeper silence, loaded with loss and despair. Sheriff Doug was dead. Hank and Harlan had fallen. Only Sam had returned alive. But for him, survival did not seem like a victory. Sam was sitting in the small office of the Big Timber Gazette, staring at the computer screen with opaque eyes. He had just written the headline he intended to send to the world, but he wasn't sure if anyone would believe it. In fact, he himself was already beginning to question if all of it had really happened. The pain in his arm, where the creature had injured him, was the only concrete proof that he was still alive. But at that moment, something broke the silence. The smell. The same nauseating smell he would never forget, rotting flesh and sulfur, began to spread through the room. Sam froze. He got up slowly, the sound of his heavy breathing echoing in the small room. His eyes moved to the window, where he first saw in the light of daylight the silver eyes. The creature was there, stopped on the deserted street, looking straight at him. Sam staggered back, knocking a chair. He knew that running would be useless. I knew that fighting would be even more futile. But even so, he took a rifle he had brought from the police station and pointed to the window. "Let's end this," he whispered, more to himself than for the creature. Before he could shoot, the creature disappeared. Not running, but suddenly, as if merged with the shadows around. He started to sweat cold, his eyes scouring the room. The smell got stronger, and then he heard her. The sound of claws scraping metal. "No, no, no, no," he murmured, turning his body quickly to look at the door behind him. The sound continued, now louder, coming from the ceiling. Sam looked up, and at that moment the creature collapsed through the lining like a living and pulsating shadow of hatred. The rifle fired, the sound echoing around the empty city, but it was useless. Sam tried to fight, but the creature's strength was superhuman. In seconds, she knocked him down, holding him against the floor with her sharp claws. He shouted, but no one was there to hear. The creature's bright eyes approached his face, as if studying him. Then, with a slow and deliberate movement, she opened her mouth, revealing ranks of so sharp teeth that they looked like blades. The last sound heard in that room was Sam's scream, abruptly interrupted. The next day, Big Timber was completely deserted. The small town, which was once moved by farmers and hunters, seemed to have been abandoned. Anyone who passed by would think that people simply left, but it was not the case. There was no one left. The police station was empty, the bar, the market, the houses. Everything seemed intact, as if the residents had hurried out. But if someone were brave enough to enter the forest, he would find something scary. Bones, bone piles and piles, scattered by clearing and trails, such as trophies of an endless hunt. The creature was still there somewhere, waiting patiently. As a force of nature, it could not be detained, understood, or overcome. She was not just a predator, it was a cruel reminder that man, despite all his technology and bravery, was still a prey to something much older and relentless. Big Timber was never mentioned in the news. The disappearance of its residents was relegated to rumors that disappeared as quickly as they arose. Over time, the city was forgotten, and the forest was once again what it always was, a place of shadows and secrets. But for those who dare explore the trails around the valley, the warning is still there. A strange smell in the air, a heavy silence that makes the neck hair goosebumps, and occasionally two bright eyes watching the shadows. The night predator is still on the loose, waiting for his next hunt. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. We love to know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support our work. We see each other in the next video.